Hi, and welcome to Upstream. I'm excited to be here today for a conversation on the topic, patch management needs a revolution. And I'm excited to be joined by Vincent Danen, Vice President of Red Hat Product Security. Vincent, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you work on?
Yeah, hey Donald, super glad to be here. Thanks for having me. Like you said, Vice President of Product Security at Red Hat, meaning we're responsible for all of the security of our products and services, whether that's supply chain related, product vulnerability response related, and compliance related. So we kind of take on that whole gamut of security for our products.
Perfect. And just to introduce myself, I'm Donald Fischer. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Tidelift, and we have a shared interest in the security and resilience of open source software. We're focused on Tidelift on the universe of open source packages used in application development and ensuring that those meet enterprise security and code health attributes that are necessary to keep us all building and moving securely in the right direction. So excellent. So I'm super excited about this one, this conversation, Vincent, because recently you published a blog post series on the Red Hat blog entitled Patch Management Needs a Revolution. And there you made a very compelling case from my perspective, including a lot of history about how we haven't really changed our thinking around this need to compulsively patch everything that's kind of built up really over decades now. It's been almost 40 years that we've been pursuing that patch everything mentality. And so, in this series, you really challenge the conventional wisdom there and the industry's thinking. So tell me a little bit more about what you were witnessing in your travels and among, in the context of Red Hat internally and Red Hat's customers externally that led you to challenge the status quo on this patch everything view of the world.
Well, I mean, obviously, the first thing is it's a lot of work, right? I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been at Red Hat for 15 years. Maybe some of the audience remembers Mandriva. I was with them for 8 prior to it. So I've been doing open source security for a long time. I remember when we started with naming CVEs, right? So naming vulnerabilities. And back then when I was doing the work, I mean, you were fixing 1 or 2 things a week. Right now, it's like 1 or 2 things every 15 minutes, globally across open source and proprietary software. And when I was looking back, just for my own curiosity, right, back in like 1999, it was less than 1,000 CVs in a year. I think last year we were over 25,000, again, globally. And this doesn't account for all ecosystems because not every single software vendor, proprietary or open source, uses CVs. Right, GitHub has their own scheme, OSV has their own scheme. So I mean, CVE is kind of the standard, but not everything gets one. And if we start looking at like mobile applications, for example, I mean, they don't even tell you if there's security updates in those things. So there's no CVEs to be there. So I expect the number of vulnerabilities in a year probably to be upwards of 35 to 50,000 a year, right? Rather than the 25,000 CVE names that we have. So when I started looking at all of that, I was like, man, we haven't really stopped to think about that patch everything mentality. I mean, patching 25,000 vulnerabilities in a year, and I'll step back and I'll say so-called vulnerabilities, because not every CVE is a vulnerability and not every vulnerability has a CV, right? So if we're looking at that, it gets ridiculously expensive when we're trying to fix everything, both for the vendor, like those who have to produce the fixes, and then the end user who has to apply those fixes. It might be a little bit easier for some proprietary operating systems where you can just kind of, lump everything together. But when you're looking at individual packages, it tends to be really expensive when you have to test the interoperability between dependencies and all of these other things. And so it just made me stop and go, are we doing this the right way? Like, it feels like there's a lot of effort for very little gain. And I was looking at a Verizon's data breach report, and they had some really interesting statistics. So if anybody hasn't looked at it, I really encourage you to look at it. What they were saying was the last couple of years, only about 5 to 7% of vulnerabilities were attributed to a software exploit. The other 80+% are, phishing, spear phishing, misconfigurations, weak passwords, things like that. None of those things are related to software, right? So I kept thinking like just 5 or 7% of vulnerabilities due to software and we're fixing everything. Like the math doesn't add up.
No, it makes sense. And I mean, even broader than just the vendor and the, customer or end user organization burden there. Also, since we're here at Upstream today, the open source maintainer burden as well, right? I mean, they're receiving some of the noise and some of the sound and fury coming from this attempt to boil the ocean, patch everything. And a lot of that is also, well, it's noise, right? I mean, it's not real risk. And so one of the things that I thought was like most provocative about your framing of this situation in your blog post series was you asked the fundamental question is, what is the purpose of this patching exercise? And you sort of drew this distinction between whether it's a compliance exercise or is this actually mitigating real risk? Is this a risk mitigation exercise? So can you tell us a little bit more about what you think about that and what's the difference?
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of came from a lot of our customers are using a lot of security tools, different vulnerability scanners, and they come to us with what I call CV shopping lists, right? So they're coming to us saying, hey, I have this spreadsheet of all these vulnerabilities, and I'd really like them to go away. And so when we stop and we start asking the questions like, well, why is this vulnerability meaningful to you? The fundamental answer is, well, my security team doesn't like it, or my auditor doesn't like it, or I want to see this list go away because I should have 0 findings before I can deploy something into production or whatever. But when you ask them the question, like how, maybe I'll use an example of like containers, right? Python module in a container, right? For us, we put that in there for DNF so that you can do updates inside of containers. We don't really recommend it, but as a quick patch mitigation, you can update software in your container. So Python modules may be there because DNF is written in Python. So if you have a customer who's using something like a Java web application, right? Only one port is accessible just for that Java web application. Java clearly doesn't use Python. So when you're asking them, why do you care about this Python module? They're like, well, it's on my list. I'm like, yeah, but you're running a Java web application. It will never be exposed. The only way that it's going to be exposed is if you have, and we've had some people do this, you're running SSH within your container and you're allowing SSH logins. Okay, that's a problem. If you allow, weak passwords and somebody SSHs into the container, maybe they can then use this vulnerability for something. Or if they have access to the cluster host itself, and then they can kind of get into the container from the host. But either way, that attacker already has access to that container. What's the real risk of them exploiting this Python vulnerability when they already have access to the container, which is an absolute no? Like you don't want that, right? So when we're looking at it from that perspective, the access that they're getting from exploiting that vulnerability is no more than they already had in order to exploit that vulnerability. In other words, that vulnerability poses no risk. And so you really have to ask the question, why are we bothering to fix this thing when no risk is being exposed here, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging to discern that kind of finer level of granularity, especially when organizations are working with code that they didn't even write or originate, right? That they brought it in either from a proprietary vendor code, which is going to be the most opaque, or even from open source community projects. That's a lot of territory to cover. You brought some data to the fight, I noticed in your blog post series. So I wonder if you could share some of those numbers, which are kind of like staggering when you kind of reduce the total volume of, and I take your point, it's just a subset of all of the issues, but CVE issues, which ones are really likely to lead to a fundamental issue like a data breach, et cetera. You had some sense of the scale of that. So could you share that with us?
Yeah, and I'll step back first and say, what is the fundamental purpose of patching a security vulnerability? It is to avoid a breach or a compromise of some sort, right? So if that's the goal, if that truly is the goal, then we're looking at those vulnerabilities that, if exploited, are going to lead to those unintended breaches and compromises, or those that are most likely to be exploited. The number was around 25,000 CVEs in a year. If I go to Verizon's report saying about 5% of breaches are based on software vulnerabilities, that means there's about 1,000 vulnerabilities in there that are impactful, right? That would potentially lead to a breach, and 24,000 that will probably never be exploited, probably never be used in a way. And honestly, an attacker who's looking at these things, because this is an investment. I mean, a lot of these are criminal enterprises, right? They want a return on investment as well. They're not going to bother with those because they're not going to get them anything, right? Mm-hmm. So if we reduce this 25,000 down to 1,000 that are actually meaningful, if we focus our attention on those 1,000 versus the 25,000 as a whole, that saves everybody an immense amount of time, effort, and energy. And so I think that if we kind of focus on those pieces, and for Red Hat, we focus on the criticals and importance, because we know that those ones are the most likely to cause that unintended consequence that leads to those compromises. Just forget about the rest. Our approach is those moderates and lows that make up the bulk of those vulnerabilities. We're just going to deal with them when they actually start to be exploited, because we don't want to put anybody in a position where there is actual risk, because we know this is being exploited in the wild. So we're going to fix those things at speed once we find out. But rather than fixing 25,000, I mean, we might fix an additional 5. I mean, honestly, last year it was probably, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was 5 or 6 known exploited vulnerabilities in the moderate and low category. So why don't we just fix those 5 or 6 versus the other, in our case, is about 1,000 moderates? Why fix all 1,000 of them when we could fix 5?
It makes sense. And I mean, I think that one of the more pointed aspects of your assessment here is that not only is the chasing of vulnerabilities, CVEs that do not represent real risk, not only is it wasted energy, but it also has this sort of crowding out effect, is how I've understood your point on this, which is the more time that you spend, time is finite and resources are finite. So the more time and resource that you spend chasing, issues that are not representing real risk, it crowds out your ability to actually take other steps, to undertake other efforts that do address real risk. So, tell me a little bit more about that. I think you have I've heard a couple of different compelling analogies from you on this over in our recent conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, like you said, time is finite, both for a vendor and for a customer, right? So if we're spending all of this effort fixing a bunch of things that ultimately don't matter, there's resources, there's costs, etc. Those resources could be used in the other 80+% area of where these breaches and compromises tend to live. And that's like phishing, spear phishing, weak passwords, misconfigurations. And there's a ton of tools that could be used for that. So why don't we invest in those tools and education for people versus trying to fix everything that doesn't make sense? Since this is Upstream and we're talking to a bunch of open source folks, I'm going to use an analogy that actually I came up with last week when we were talking. And it really is about the transparency of open source versus the opaqueness of proprietary software. And I kind of look at it as, I brought props, so I hope you don't mind. I look at it as like this water bottle, right? So I can see precisely how much water is in here. So let's take this as the sum total of vulnerabilities in a product or a project. The bulk of these are going to be low and moderate vulnerabilities. So if I look at it, maybe, we'll go up to this line here. This is your criticals and your importance. This is the stuff that matters. But I can still see the rest of this, right? So if I'm sitting here looking at it from I want my bottle to be empty, I need to drink all of this, which means most of these lows and moderates that don't matter, right? And that's kind of one of the benefits of open source in terms of transparency. If we look at it from a proprietary side, it's a little bit like this. It's water too. I mean, it's flavored water, right? But in here, when you're looking at it, you have no idea how much water is in here. So I can't tell, like, are the criticals and importance sitting here and the rest of this is nothing? Or is a proprietary vendor going to say, no, 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 it's all criticals and importance? And maybe I should have gotten a smaller container, right? Because that's kind of what it looks like. It looks like there's a lot less vulnerabilities on the proprietary side because you can't tell what's there. Like, we have no idea if they're fixing these things and not telling us, they're aware of them and just not fixing them because they're like, these are just basically bugs. There's literally no information, right? Contrasting that to open source where you do have that information. And I think that's one of the, I call it Damocles sword, right? It is one of the benefits of open source is I can see everything. And if there's something in there that I'm uncomfortable with and I have an actual use case for it, I can go to my vendor and say, hey, this thing is actually impactful for me. And could you please fix it? Or because it's open source, I can take matters into my own hands and I can patch it as well, right? Or I know that there's a vulnerability there and I can swap out a dependency or change my code or something like that based on that. Like, you have options. On the proprietary side, you don't. And I'll add one more thing that I think is a little bit ironic as well. We use CISA's KEV, so the known exploited vulnerabilities list. And when you look at that, the top 5 vendors who are contributing exploits to our ecosystem are not open source vendors. They're not open source projects. These are proprietary companies. So it is almost ironic that even though it's very opaque like this, most of those exploits are coming from proprietary vendors where, I mean, we don't know how long they've been sitting there for. It was interesting. The XZ backdoor, for example, right? So, okay, that happened in open source. Was it a good thing? Obviously not, right? We don't want to see those things. It's also not the first time it's happened, and it's probably not going to be the last. There was a lot of criticism on open source about it taking 2 months to discover this, right? I actually think that 2 months isn't that big of a deal. For most end users, zero impact. It was mostly like bleeding edge distributions. If you obtain this stuff from Upstream directly yourself, I look at it as open source working as designed. The interesting thing when I went looking for like other examples of this happening was I think it's maybe 20 years ago, Borland's Interbase, when they donated it and open sourced it to the Firebird project, right? They found
going way back here. I like this. We're going down history lane here.
Yeah, this is old stuff. But what Borland did is so they open sourced it. They gave it away, and then people could actually start looking at the source code. And what did they find shortly after they had open sourced it? That a hard-coded username and password had been in there for 7 years, undiscovered. So in its proprietary lifetime of 7 years, there was a backdoor. And then as soon as it was open sourced, I think it was within a couple months, it was discovered and then quickly removed. I mean, that if that's not a testament to the power and beauty of open source, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that XZ really is a success story for open source, the open source development model. And actually, my co-founder, CTO of Tidelift, Jeremy Katz, published a blog post in the days following, really making that argument well. I mean, part of what I hear you saying is sort of a restatement of the famous Linus's law. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. That's sort of part of that. The Borland case there, the code's been there the whole time. It's just we haven't been able to see it. But I also think you're advancing an additional additive layer to it. I don't know if it's like Vincent's lemma or something like that, perhaps, which is this point of given transparency into the ingredients of an application, the risk assessment can be undertaken with more fidelity, right? And trusted, but also verified, right? To your point around when it's in that opaque bottle, a vendor assurance, we got it, and it's all we're on top of it. Don't worry about it. That's nice to have, but that's no longer sufficient, I think, given the reality of, for example, what's on the known exploited vulnerability list that CISA maintains. A lot of that are proprietary products where the vendor said, all good, we got it, best security in the biz, and all software is software and is all subject to unknowable in advance vulnerabilities.
Well, and it's actually interesting that you note that, because there is a drive towards more transparency. And despite the critics of open source, right? I mean, transparency is effectively our heritage. But you're looking at things like, we want SBOMs. We want to know what's in all of these things. So, I mean, they're asking for the transparency of how these products are assembled. They didn't ask for that before. Now it's important. You're looking at things like the vulnerability exploitability exchange, or VEX documents, right? They want more transparency into what's actually affected by a vulnerability. And honestly, just to make it easy, they want to know what's not vulnerable. I mean, I find it ironic sometimes that we actually get asked to say what's not vulnerable to certain types of vulnerabilities, and they'll come to us like with Windows CVEs. I'm like, this is a Linux operating system. What do you think we're affected by a Windows CVE? Of course not. But they want to know because they don't have some customers don't have the expertise, right? So they're like, you need to tell us as clearly as possible whether or not we're affected or not affected by these things. And that is a growing demand that I see across the industry. So if I think about it, those open source principles of transparency are showing up in places that are not traditional open source. And people want to know, because that's how they make appropriate risk-based decisions. And if you don't have that, then you err on the side of maybe fear. And you're like, well, I need to fix everything because I don't know what I can't trust. I don't know what I don't know. And I'm stuck. And my only option, because I don't have that experience or that understanding, is to ask for everything. And that is a very expensive proposition. So we're trying to do a number of things where we can provide more clarity and transparency to how products are assembled, what vulnerabilities are affected, vulnerabilities themselves, right? To provide that information to people so they can make those appropriate risk-based decisions.
Yeah, I'm delighted that transparency is being actively sought by sophisticated purchasers of technology products and services, just in their own best interests, right? That's a way for them to ensure better cybersecurity outcomes for their organizations. I'm also glad that there's exogenous forces kind of moving that process along. So for example, here at Upstream today, we also have a conversation with a couple of representatives, folks working very actively on this from the U.S. Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, Jack Cable and Ava Black. And so we're hearing from them about the policy steps that are helping to push that along, and also some of the preview into some of the maybe more binding requirements that will help move that along. And that's already happening in the government, U.S. government supplier base, where there's now formal requirements for things like SBOMs, et cetera. And I know your team knows that better than most. You're responsible for assembling quite a few of those for the Red Hat product family, right?
Yeah. Well, and like you said, I mean, those are really important things. And I guess one of the reasons why, you go back to that blog post that I was writing, is it's really important for particularly governments and regulators to understand this notion that patching everything is not in our best interest, right? Because my concern is if they start putting these things into law, that you can have no known vulnerabilities in a product or else we can't use it. I mean, that pushes everybody out, because nobody can do it, right? Because we can sit there and say, yeah, there's no known vulnerabilities today, and tomorrow that changes, right? So at some point we have to sit there and go, what's acceptable risk, right? We deal with the things that are the most risky, right? Like driving in a car without a seatbelt, I would say, is quite reckless, right? So we'll take care of those sorts of things. For some of the other things, like I didn't get my oil changed when the vehicle manufacturer told me I should, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to risk driving it a little bit further without that oil. I mean, that's acceptable risk, right? We have to be comfortable with those sorts of things.
It makes sense to me. So maybe to bring us back to recenter on our overall overarching theme for Upstream this year, it's new ideas for solving the usual problems. So some of these things are especially around open source supply chain resilience, not new problems, growing problems, just because of the good news that we're basing more and more of our civilization on open source software and software in general. So, you referenced the recent episode around the XE utils package. We've had Log4Shell and these other examples of challenges in our open source software supply chain. And we've had this like patching industrial complex build up over the years that are, setting off lots of alarms and almost seemingly getting rewarded sometimes for generating noise.
Mm-hmm.
If we accept your premise that this sort of chasing one's tail, patch everything mindset is not the way to go, and if you were the czar for the day that could blow up the existing system and rebuild it in a more orderly, sensible manner, what's your vision for how we could approach this with in a more coherent way that leads to better outcomes?
Oh man, that's a loaded question. I have so many ideas. For the one, I would stop this demand for fixing all known vulnerabilities, right? Like, I mean, for me, it's reckless and it's silly. It's expensive and it actually introduces risk, right? Because every time you make changes to code, there is the possibility that new risk is being introduced, potentially worse than the thing that you fixed. I'll refer to shell shock as an example and how many times it took to patch that to get it correct. I would probably look at it like from a scanning perspective, right? I mean, there are things that we just have to say, these things don't matter. I would take low vulnerabilities off the board entirely. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and everyone that I've ever looked at, they are effectively bugs, right? No different than any other bug. Like I clicked here and the thing crashed. Oh my goodness, is that a CV? No, it's not. Just maybe don't click that again and file a bug report, right? So I think lows have to be taken off entirely. And that helps a little bit. That maybe removes 20% of those vulnerabilities that show up. Moderates are a bit of a tricky area, right? Because some of them could be impactful, depending on vulnerability chaining and things like that. And I think it's really an awareness piece where you have to be aware of what's potential, right? What has the potential for creating that risk, and then also having observability, right? And this is why I love CIS's KEV, because it'll tell us. I mean, if the U.S. government is telling us we have actual indicators of compromise and seeing these things being exploited, you need to patch this, then I think it's on everybody's responsibility as an end user to actually patch those things. And more often than not, I think over the last 2 or 3 years that we've been using it, there have been like a small handful of vulnerabilities that we hadn't already fixed that showed up on that list. And so again, when we see those, we're going to fix them. We put a patch out, kind of expect you to apply it, right? And that goes to the end user responsibility as well. If those patches are available, use them, right? Like we don't recklessly push these patches out without any kind of testing or anything like that. And speaking specifically for Red Hat here, we do a lot of quality engineering and testing and all of these sorts of things so that you can apply these patches and you don't have to do the full gamut of QE testing yourself, right? That's one of the promises that we have is the kind of stability and low code change. That's why we backport things in the first place. So we're not introducing a lot of code change. So when those patches are available, apply them. And that would be one of the other things that I would probably mandate, right? If I were like the czar, as you say, like if a patch is available, don't have your 90-day patch window or your 60-day patch window or, quarterly patch day. Patch that thing when it's available because it was provided for a reason, right? We're not trying to, our business model isn't to create as many patches as we can, right? We provide those patches so that we can secure our customers, so that they can avail themselves of those fixes, actually apply them. I think that in a number of cases, and we've seen some of this happen in the past, patches were available, they weren't applied, and then somebody was breached, right? We've seen that with like Log4Shell, saw that back with some of the Struts 2 things quite a few years ago. Like those patches need to be applied. And I think that I would put the focus exclusively on critical and important vulnerabilities. And I would also say, like, trust the vendor. I think it's interesting some of the things that have been going on with the NVD and the database there. Having one single, maybe less educated source of truth for all things everywhere. And I mean, open source being ubiquitous, it's Mac, it's Windows, it's Linux, it's everywhere, right? You can't assign one score and have it apply to everything when we build it different, use it different, and have our underlying technologies different, right? So, I mean, there is a recognition of the vendor has some expertise, right? And if you trust them for your workloads and you trust them with your data, why aren't you trusting them with an assessment of vulnerabilities? Because we're not, and I think I can speak for all vendors here, we're not here to do less work because we don't feel like it. Like, I think we all take that responsibility on very seriously to provide those fixes and actually deal with them as appropriate, because it's our responsibility. And I see this a lot, actually. If I take this to open source maintainers, I see this a ton there, right? Like, if I look at those guys who did the log4j fixes, all those patches, and I would not want to be there. I mean, it sucked to be us, but for the work that they were doing and the amount of hassle that they were getting from people, like just bombarding them with questions and stuff, and for them to still get those patches out as quickly as they could, I mean, they took that on as their responsibility as the maintainers of these things. So I don't think it's fair to say that people don't want to provide security fixes because it's boring or it's not important. We all feel that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a very important point there around the citing the case of the log4j maintainers, for example. A lot of there's a clear narrative that is correct, I believe, around the role and the responsibility of vendors, right? But for a large set of open source projects that are commercially applied, that are part of our software supply chains, there are not traditional vendors there, right? And so then the question is, what is the role of independent open source maintainers where it's not their day job, they're not part of a shrink wrap or a hosted software company where their job is to maintain this, but they have a role, an essential role to play, and they have also, to your point around the single party vetting and scoring risk, they're the creators of these packages. They have the detailed perspective. They know facts about the projects, and they can ensure practices around the projects that are not observable by somebody just scraping GitHub, et cetera. So, it probably goes without saying for the audience here at Upstream at Tidelift, we have a really strong view that these open source maintainers, they have an essential role to play, but we need to create a mechanism to reward them for doing these important tasks that really only they can do, or at the very least they can do best, that all of us are going to rely on them to get done. And so, I think in the regulatory lens here, you have discussions around, in the US, I see a lot of policy discussions. I see a lot of discussion of responsibility should fall on those organizations most capable of responding, and there it's implicitly the vendors in the open source context, the vendors that use open source incorporate into their products. In the European policy discussions that have been going on over the last year, there's been a discussion, the introduction of this notion of a steward. Often it's viewed as like the foundation, the open source foundation corresponding to an open source project. But really, if you view the world through a true reality-based, risk-based perspective, a huge portion of the open source that organizations rely on, it comes not through a vendor. It comes directly into the organization from an open source package repository. There's not a foundation for it. It's we've noted that the median number of maintainers on an open source project in application development is 1. So there's not big stewardship, governance organizations around most of the open source that we use. So, tell me what's your perspective on what is the appropriate ask for these open source maintainers, and what is the apportionment of responsibility between those independent creators who give us these ingredients, the organizations that incorporate those things into their products, end user organizations that incorporate them directly. What's the best way for us to solve this problem, especially grounded in that reality that so much of this comes from volunteers?
Yeah, and I think the thing that comes to mind the most is it takes a village, right? Like everybody has a role to play. It's very easy to say, Those who are making money off of it, like commercial vendors, they should be held the most responsible. But it's just not that simple, I don't think, right? And like the foundations that are involved, I mean, they're there to govern a community, not necessarily have technical direction of the project, right? Which means that they're not hands-on in the code. So is holding a foundation responsible for the quality of the code appropriate? I don't know, right? I think that at the end of the day, this is fundamentally what I see, and I know this because I've had a number of open source projects that I've initiated, and then since retired because I was a single maintainer and wasn't being paid for it, right? And then you just interest changes, time moves on. I think if you're using a component that's important to you, it behooves you to contribute back to that community, right? Whether that is directly as a maintainership role, a sponsorship role, like you're financially incentivizing the maintainer, right, or the author of this code, or you're contributing to it in some other way that makes their life easier, right? I think it's wildly inappropriate, and this actually really bothered me about the whole Log4j thing. For a lot of commercial vendors who say, "Oh, I use your product and I need you to attest to these things and I need you to do all this stuff." And it's like, hey man, you just downloaded this stuff off the internet. I don't know you anything, right? Particularly since you haven't. The only thing you've done for me is added a counter on my little download click, right? Like, yay, that's not exciting. So I mean, like, how do we get more people involved in uh, a personal stake in some of these projects that are important to them, particularly when a lot of companies are downloading and using open source directly from Upstream for their own applications, right? If I look at it from say from a Red Hat perspective, right? So we have our UBI, our universal base image for a container, which is great. You can run it, but you're going to put something on it because running a container just to run a container is effectively like, okay, you're just wasting your compute resources. So you're throwing something on top of it. Chances are those things are going to be built of components that aren't shipped in the UBI, probably not shipped by Red Hat at all. So you're pulling these things directly from Upstream, right? This is where your own SBOM is important. Like you need to identify these dependencies. You need to identify which parts of this are maybe critical for you. And then you have to go out to that maintainer, not with a I need, but what do you need? What sort of help do you need? And I'll tell you, I mean, not to brown nose or anything like that, but I love your business model. Like I love Tidelift, and in fact, I'm really sad. Sorry, I'm going to sidestep here a little bit. I got some Tidelift socks at I think it was like the open source summit a year ago, and yesterday I realized there was a big hole in the heel, so I had to throw my favorite socks away. So
we can do something there. I know a guy.
Thanks, Don. But I mean, my point there is like the way that companies can funnel money through you to those projects that are important to them, and they get value, right? Everybody gets value in that. The people who are paying you to give to the maintainers are getting that value of some assurance of that software that they depend on, and those maintainers are getting some value for their work. Like now they're actually getting paid for it, right? Which is huge value for them, and I think that we need to do more of that. And like the whole responsibility piece here is just it's really tricky, but I think we have to figure it out, and doing it through legislation, like initial incarnations of the CRA saying that end developers would be held responsible. Like
that was scary.
We can't have things like that. Like that shows such a lack of understanding and empathy of how open source is actually built, because at that point you've killed open source, because now it's way too risky for me as an individual to write any code for the public to consume. And that halts innovation. Like,
yeah, immediately. Yeah. The way that I view it is, it's like in so many aspects of human dynamics, parenting, organizational dynamics, punishment only gets you so far. Right? Yep. Getting slapped on the wrist for taking that action. A more constructive, a more durable way to approach things is going to be, let's create incentives that are aligned, right? And reward people for good behavior. So that's where the energy of the Tidelift model comes from is, instead of, putting requirements, unfunded mandates onto open source creators demanding that they do things. Let's meet them halfway and say, hey, thank you for creating this open source component. You probably didn't expect that to become part of the supply chain of modern society. It is. So we need you, we want to ask you to do more. And we have a specific set of things that only you can do around secure development practices and giving us telemetry and information about the future of your project. It's valuable to the organizations that use this, so they will pay you like actual money to undertake these activities and do it. So, I think incentives, positive incentives are a better way to go than these punitive actions that are going to cause people to retreat and shut down and could, I think I agree with your point, really undermine the opportunity that that we've jointly created with open source software.
Yeah,
man, this has been a lot of fun, Vincent, this conversation.
No, I mean, no, I love having these chats with you, Donald. That's great. One of the things I'm super passionate about, I don't know if you can tell.
I love that about you, and I love the fresh perspective that you bring. And we had Linus's law that with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. I think there's a Vincent's lemma forming here. I'm going to try to make it happen. It's like, given enough transparency, all risk can be practically assessed. Maybe, I don't know. I'll go try to make I'm going to try to run with that meme. I super appreciate your joining us at Upstream today and lending your perspective on how both organizations and the maintainers who make all this happen, how we can work together to get to the outcomes that we need. Thank you so much for joining us at Upstream, Vincent.
Thanks so much for having me, Donald. It's a true pleasure.